Okay, fantastic. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining in. This is a webinar that is dedicated to the discussion of e-mobility in Africa, specifically ways in which we can boost academic research. My name is Bijou, and I am affiliated with IMDA, based in Nairobi, Kenya. I have a background in electrical power systems engineering, and I am passionate about e-mobility growth in Africa. Alongside me, I have today some incredible minds joining us, 3 engineers by identity, by profession, and I think they will be able to introduce themselves just now in a moment. But yes, welcome everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for attending. So I will leave the floor open to our wonderful panelists to each give a short intro of who they are, where they're coming from, where exactly they are in the world, and to just give us a bit of a teaser of what we can expect from their unique experiences within the realms of this topic of boosting academic research. So welcome Cameron, welcome James, and welcome Ignatius. And please go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Sure. I'll maybe start off and maybe just quickly get a presentation shared with you, which will take a few seconds. Yeah, that should be loading up now. Can you see that?
Yes, it is. Yeah, that's good. It's coming.
Okay, great. So thanks and so much. Thanks so much to IMDA and partners for organizing this event, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. So I'm a research associate at the Energy Futures Lab, which is Imperial College London's Global Energy Institute. And the institute was established in 2005 to address global energy challenges by identifying and leading new opportunities to serve industry, governments, and society at large through high quality research, evidence, and advocacy for positive change. So an important part of the strategy of the Energy Futures Lab is to foster research addressing energy access and decarbonization in low and middle income countries. So my focus is on the interaction between low carbon energy systems and electric mobility, with a specific focus on electric 2- and 3-wheelers in Africa. So the project that I'm currently working on is called P4G. It's called Charger Project. It's funded by P4G, and it's looking into battery swapping infrastructure for electric 2- and 3-wheelers in Nairobi. So we've got a number of partners on the project. We've got Strathmore University as an academic partner. So Ignatius, who's on the call now, has been part of that work. We have Arkride and Fika Mobility as commercial partners, providing data from their electric motorcycles, batteries, and swap stations. And we have Energy for Impact as an administrative partner on the project. So the project has, a number of different components, and my focus is on investigating the technical configurations and the best locations for siting battery swap stations based on the analysis of data that's going to be provided by these commercial partners. So that's kind of what I've been working on and what my experience on e-mobility in an African context is based on, and I'm looking forward to kind of discussing these different things today. Thanks.
Thank you, Cameron. James, if you're ready.
Yes, I am. Sorry, I was just on mute. Just same thing should be happening. Can you see my slides? Yeah, all good. Okay, so thanks again, Bijou, and thanks, Cameron, for that. I guess sort of similar background in that I'm sat in the UK, far away, and I work at the University of Oxford as a research fellow in transport energy systems, and my main project at the moment is called Climate Compatible Growth, which I'm recognizing names on the list. I think we have some. It's quite a small world. Bijou and I were just saying like how this project has come to be. So Climate Compatible Growth is a kind of pretty large £40 million UK FCDO, so the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office sponsored project that's, I think, in rough language, is aiming to support or provide supporting evidence towards the green transition across our partner countries, two of which are currently in Africa. That's Kenya and Zambia, but this is seemed to be growing all the time. It's a really exciting region, and for me, what I'm interested in, I'm an engineer by training, but I now work in the School of Geography and Environment at Oxford. So it's kind of taking a more holistic view on mobility systems and how they interact with social practice, with the electricity system. And I think mobility is especially interesting because that context of the vehicle, how that interacts with both practices of mobility in different contexts, and I use the plural of contexts, of course, because what works in Kenya might well not work in Burkina Faso, or this is a multitude of different things to think about, right? And there's so much work is my main message of this presentation. Basically, we need to think about how e-mobility interacts with a electricity system, how that electricity system changes in terms of fostering growth of renewables. That shows a geothermal power station in Kenya and a generic solar farm too. How it interacts with the end user. So to what extent the technologies and services that are present in how a user accesses these technologies, and how they interact with people, and indeed how they interact with the rest of the system. So that top image is actually in Taiwan, in East Asia, and that particular installation of electric two-wheelers helps support high renewables power systems going forwards, because a two-way energy exchange from the batteries can help fluctuations in supply. So, some of the research we'll be doing is to what extent could we mimic that kind of system in African countries. And then we also have to think about what are the implications for the kind of real transition to sustainable transport systems. How do the users of these mobilities change, and what part does it have in ensuring kind of green inclusive growth? So I think I put 4 kind of summary points. Firstly, transport is what we would call a wicked problem, which basically means that all the sectors are interacting. It's so difficult to make sense of, and it's constantly changing. The interactions of mobility and e-mobility tech with all these sectors of the economy are really difficult to understand, but research is important because it allows us to understand how these things work, and it allows us to gain knowledge and provide innovation on advancing low carbon inclusive growth in e-mobility. So these big questions need massive research efforts, and essentially I think we could narrow down on 2 that we're kind of involved in the climate compatible growth. And first is, how does Africa's e-mobility transition interact with things like the shifting mobility needs of communities, the changing electricity system, government's economic growth targets, and the need for effective climate finance? And secondly is using that knowledge gained to ask, how can we ensure an African e-mobility transition that locks in low carbon inclusive growth? And this is just a little plug for this project. So hopefully some of you have heard of it. We have some colleagues on the call, but if you just Google the words climate compatible growth, you should come across this stuff. And if you Google my name with Oxford University, you should be able to find contact details for me as well. And I'd be really willing to take this forward. But thank you. That's my slides.
Thank you so much, James, for a very thorough intro into what you do. And Ignatius, if you would please let us know who you are and give us a bit of a background of your organization as well.
Hello, sorry I'm on the road, but thank you, James, for the great presentation. And thank you, Shihan, as well. So I am Ignatius Maranga. I'm an engineer from Strathmore University. I'm an electrical engineer. That's my background. And I also work on electric mobility projects. So currently, I've worked on a number of projects on electric mobility. So one, we designed a solar-powered tuk-tuk. You can call it e-tuk-tuk. So a solar-powered trike. Then the current project we're working on right now is checking on charging stations in Nairobi, so electric vehicle charging stations for electric buses, because the Kenyan government wants to put up electric buses. So convenience charging and depot charging as well. So yeah, I'll say that is my experience so far on electric vehicles. And apologies, I'm on the road, so yeah. So
No worries, Ignatius. Thank you so much for joining in. And that's the wonders of technology. We can join in from wherever we are. So right before we begin our deep dive into the topic, I'd like to also thank our sponsors by name. I'd like to thank the United Nations Environmental Programme. I'd like to thank EV Charger, OnTap, The Waterfront in Karen for being able to facilitate their support for this webinar series. And I think just a nice way of introducing this topic and to really get into it. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions, and also then audience is encouraged to plug in their questions, plug in your insights. Let's make this conversation as engaging and as insightful as possible from hearing from all the different players available. Just type in the chat. Let us just dive into the idea of academic research. In your opinion, this is a question to Cameron, to James, and to Ignatius. Why is it vital? Why are we even thinking about boosting academic research of e-mobility in Africa? Would you be able to share your insights on that?
So perhaps I will start first. You see, academic research. You see, we need research to solve problems, right? And that is the main theme and idea of research, right? Coming from academia, you see, we need to solve problems, and the only way we can solve problems is through scientific research, well thought through ideas to solve problems, right? Yeah, and I think this is the only way we can go about it, because we don't have any other way to go about solving problems other than academic research, because this is scientific problem solving, right?
Thank you, Ignatius. I think that's a really good way of putting it. Would you be having insights on that, James and Cameron?
Yeah, I think Ignatius put it well, right? I think for me, the difficulty with any kind of massive transition is that these problems affect all these adjacent sectors, right? So I think you know, you can allow technology to grow relatively organically, but the kind of crunch issues that will come up. So, for example, at what stage electricity grids need reinforcing? At what stage can you guarantee certain communities can have access to certain changes within mobility systems? You could, by kind of researching and by kind of drawing on the benefits of academia and research institutions, universities, you can really put needed effort into answering some of those questions. But yeah, I mean everyone's very excited, right? The global e-mobility market is expected to be worth over $1.5 trillion by 2028. So it feels like this thing is going to happen, but research is needed to make sure that the transition is the kind of transition that we need, right, globally, and particularly in different contexts in Africa as to this call.
Yeah, I mean, I think adding to what James said, it's a very exciting field to be in. And, you know, I think academic institutions are really vital because they can take on that role of investigating and providing solutions to many of the issues that the commercial e-mobility sector doesn't necessarily have the time or resources to solve. And so that can lead to a lot of innovation that can then be commercialized by the sector. And obviously academic institutions themselves and research can also build capacity in that e-mobility sector to really allow it to grow.
Wow, those are some really cool responses. I had no idea that there were about 1.5 trillion by 2028, James mentioned. That's insane. That's a large amount that's going to be contributed towards e-mobility. Wow. And when you think about it, what do you think is the most vital thing about now the growth of e-mobility, or specifically in boosting it? Do you think that the main actor here is the government? Is it academic institutions? Who do you think is the main actor really to push this agenda forward?
Who are you asking first? Sure, Ignatius, do you?
Okay. So, I mean, on my end, I think it's the government more than academia, because you see, incentives and regulations are formed by the government, right? So, like for instance, let me give an example of Kenya. One of the challenges, or what can drive e-mobility in Kenya, for instance, is the government, and then the government encouraging electric mobility in the country, thanks to regulations, right, and incentives. So, for instance, tax incentives, because right now electric vehicles are, I mean, they cost quite much, but then only the government can help us or can assist. Can assist pushing up electric mobility in the country, in my opinion. Yeah. So academia, yes, academia will work on research, but then the government has to take up this research. They have to take up the regulations, and they have to take up the thesis that we write, yeah, and the research that we work on.
Yeah, I would maybe just add to that. I think it's a good point. I think maybe the things that governments often lack around the world is insights as to what their resources will do. Governments always have caps on their resources, right? Whether that be measured in terms of public spending or whatever. But essentially, you have something like a value of $1 per tons of carbon abated or removed from global greenhouse gas emissions. So what research can do is I think enable governments to have a much clearer view on where to put their money. I think I mean, you mentioned EV subsidies. It depends what kind of EVs are subsidized and for whom they are subsidized. I mean, in most places in the world, in fact, in every country in the world, expensive cars are a preserve of the well-off, right? That's kind of a fact, and it's so you kind of have to ask whether you're subsidizing individual private vehicles is going to be more beneficial compared to, for instance, in the East African context, subsidizing paratransit vehicles as a way to attack much more of the kind of the modal split in the kind of mobility system. So I think it's a really interesting point that as to whether government uses research or government commissions research or which way around that relationship goes.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about whether we're talking about whose role it is in either growing academic research or growing the e-mobility sector, because like Ignatius said, I think the government has a much larger role in terms of growing the sector itself by implementing those kind of learnings from the research being done by academic institutions. So in that sense, government is really maybe one of the main actors in terms of that kind of growth. If you're looking at growth in academic research, then I guess the universities obviously play a very central role. They're kind of acting as research hubs that can then disseminate that kind of information back to government and the other stakeholders. So yeah, I think it's quite difficult to say who's the most important, but I think they each play their own part.
Oh, wow, those are really cool insights. I think this is amazing. When you think about it, do you see that there's this situation going on where like the government has a very big role in there and universities do too? So is there like a party in between the two? Who exactly now gets to have a say and contribute now the push? Who exactly now leads this boosting per se? How are we going to actually, let's say, kick off the boosting of academic research of e-mobility in Africa? Who do you think will really actually take the charge on this? What are your thoughts?
That was just a notification to say Ignatius is leaving, which is sad. His phone is going off. Maybe he can rejoin us. Hopefully, it would be really great to hear. Yeah, for me, I mean, I don't think I have a credible, concrete answer to that. I think these things have to go hand in hand, right? Like ultimately, government either funds research or it helps to generate research programs that can attract private sector financing. But there's always going to be a sort of you know, collaboration between these different parties. I think speaking in our context, you know, CCG is funded by the UK government, and it's enabled a lot of in-country partners in our partner countries today, Kenya and Zambia and Africa, to make use of that funding, which comes from the UK government to support local research activities. And it's really, you know, sat here, you know, I am thousands of miles away from Africa, right? But our colleagues at Strathmore Energy Research Centre and Copperbelt University in Zambia and University of Nairobi are all doing really amazing stuff, and it's kind of amazing to be doing that. So I think it paints a picture of how this collaboration can take place across governments, across research institutions and the private sector. But I don't think any one in particular is the leader, so to speak.
Yeah, I would agree with James on that. It's very difficult to pinpoint one major actor that's responsible for everything. It's kind of a huge collaborative effort, and everyone kind of needs to be supporting each other and kind of working together.
Oh, thank you so much for those responses. I'm seeing some really cool questions in the chat. So we have a question here that is asking about, you know, given the current climate of energy scarcity and high prices, and also the big elephant in the room, we have resource scarcity for battery production. How would you see e-mobility developing further in Africa? What are your thoughts about shared mobility, for example?
Do you want to go first, Cameron? I went first in the last one. Oh, you're on mute.
So I'm just having a quick look at that question, just to double check. Yeah, I mean, so we're looking at energy scarcity and high prices being that big elephant in the room, as Danny's mentioned. How do we see e-mobility developing further in Africa? I mean, it's a tricky thing, I guess. Obviously, on the battery side, you've got issues on sustainable resource use for battery developments and chemistries, and along with that, and battery production is you know, mainly using resources from African countries and then being exported to other places like China to be produced, and then that's bringing those back in. We're having to import those back into African countries to use them, which is a tricky situation. And in the previous session today, someone mentioned that it is quite tricky for, you know, local, say, those countries that have those resources to actually develop their own manufacturing capacity, because a lot of the contracts from those mines are, say, fixed in terms of their take hold of resources, and it's very difficult to produce things locally, to develop that kind of local production or like manufacturing capacity. So it's, in terms, I'm not really too sure if I'm answering the question, but it is a big issue, and I think for now we're going to have to rely on a lot of the components being imported into Africa, but there is a lot of local manufacturing that can be done on different components, like the frames and the seats and those kinds of things that can be done locally. So I think from the work I've had with startups in the sector in Kenya, they're looking to try and bring as much manufacturing to the to the local area. But there's obviously certain components that can't at this point really be done locally. So that's a big issue that they're going to have to work with going forward. Yeah, so that's my 2 bits for now.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that I think it's a really interesting question, and I think talking in CCG frame, our null hypothesis, I suppose, is that if financed sufficiently, then the greener options tend to be cheaper in most use cases, because converting solar irradiation to voltages across terminals is fundamentally cheaper than, or fundamentally easier now, given the technology landscape, than going and digging oil out of the ground. And I think it's interesting to consider how the current global energy crisis and price crisis and whatever else you want to call it impacts that null hypothesis. And I mean, if there's anyone on the call that can kind of give us an insight, I think it would be really interesting to hear. I mean, talking to colleagues at IEMDA, it seems like in Kenya, it actually supports the e-mobility transition, right? Because petrol prices have gone through the roof, but at the same time, the electricity consumer prices are regulated, and it comes mostly from geothermal and solar and wind, right? So you're seeing that the kind of fundamental energy vectors of the differential between the prices, they're shifting in favor of these green technologies. On the other hand, in my country, in the UK, it's hurting the e-mobility transition, right? Because we only generate 40% of electricity from gas, but gas sets the market price essentially because of how the UK's electricity market works. So that means that electricity has gone up at a faster rate than petrol, right? So before, whereas you could say, oh, if you get an electric vehicle, you can save this massive amount on your fueling bills. That is now being eaten away at, and we have to ask, how can we help support that? But yeah, as far as I know, in Kenya, it's a positive thing. I'd be really interested to hear anyone on the call, if they're from other countries, how that compares. I mean, particularly countries with big kind of petroleum elements of the economy. If anyone's from Nigeria or somewhere that where these kind of things are prevalent. But yeah.
Thank you so much for those answers. I mean, like, that really does put things into context, that actually this is ultimately connected to the particular, let's say, power production that does sustain now the e-mobility that will push it forward. And for Africa, this is actually what's driving us forward, the fact that we do have a lot of renewables supporting our electricity production. So I can see another question here from Musiani Chewe. He says, or she says, they say that to James and Cameron, have you found that the government actors and institutions are receptive to your research? So coming from what you're doing, how has your experience been?
It's a great question. It really, I mean, obviously, it really depends who, which government you're talking to, what level of government. I've had really interesting chats with government stakeholders in both Kenya and Zambia, which are our 2 African CCG partner countries, and it's been, I will just say, refreshingly encouraging to hear government stakeholders interested in what research you're doing. Compared to the UK, it can feel like there's a real reception for research. And yeah, sweeping generalization, but it's been really encouraging. So we're working with, for instance, colleagues at University of Nairobi and Strathmore University, going forward over the next 6 months or so to generate and pull together these kind of Kenyan transport energy storylines, which are going to go forward into a body of modelling that we're doing over the next couple of years of CCG to help inform government level decision making on which areas to support basically in the transport sector. Obviously, a key one is e-mobility. And I think what we're able to do in Kenya, and has also been our experience in Zambia, is lock in government engagement from the start of the project, rather than have to go away and then try and present your findings. So yeah, nothing but positive feedback really on that question.
Yeah, we've had similar positive interactions in Kenya as well. We hosted a technical working group. I think it was in June this year, and we had a number of different government stakeholders that did attend that and gave presentations and kind of asked for the types of information that they kind of need to hear from industry as well as the research community. One of those being EPRA, which is the Energy and Petroleum Regulation Authority, I think, in Kenya. And they're asking what are the kind of tariffs or preferential electricity tariffs that you're asking for, and what kind of evidence can you give for that to be the case that you need those kind of incentives for e-mobility. So there is definitely, I would say, positive engagement with the various stakeholders.
That is fantastic to hear that the reception has been really effective. And I think just first-hand reactions from my side is when it comes to now the sharing of that information, whenever you have, like, let's say, those technical working groups and you're able to perform your research, is this information available to, let's say, other researchers? What are the ways in which now you're able to communicate your learnings to the general public, for example?
Yeah, so in terms of that technical working group that I mentioned, Strathmore University has been working on a report on the outcomes that were discussed during that and the kind of ways that could influence policy and types of policy recommendations that are needed. So we're expecting that report to be coming out relatively shortly. But in terms of our general idea of sharing this kind of information is that we're very pro that, and the main points, or a lot of the parts of this project, is to kind of share as much information openly to kind of encourage other researchers and as well as the commercial sector in the e-mobility sector to kind of get involved and have access to that information.
Yeah, similar stuff. So at CCG, we I don't know if we borrowed it or we invented it, I'm not sure. We do something called Euphoria, which is U for IRA, and it's basically a coded practice of open science. So everything we publish is going to be available to everyone. So one big blocker of kind of the thing I hate most about the academic industry is that a lot of your research outputs will end up behind a paywall on Science Direct or something, and people who aren't at universities can't access them. So everything we're doing through CCG is open access. They're generally as well supplanted by policy briefs and kind of short, snippy, kind of 2 or 3 pages that can help. I mean, very few people want to read like an in-depth 15-page scientific journal or have the time. A 2-page summary might well be much easier. So we're doing a series of COP27 policy briefs, as we did last year, COP26. That are all around encouraging. We have a set of amazing authors from all around the world, lots of countries in Africa, producing policy briefs on research that they've done, and this could be in academic institutions or it could be in private sector companies and consultancies, whatever, and it's providing a platform to be able to share that research, basically. So we're going to have a presence at COP, which you'll be able to hear about if you stay in the loop with CCG, and that's going to be all about sharing that good stuff. We've also we funded an open access special issue of Transport Policy, which is a kind of pretty fancy journal for all things in transport related to policy recommendations. That's going to be published hopefully before the end of this year. Before the end of 2022, and that kind of showcases a little bit of the efforts in this. So all the authors, or there were kind of rules about who could author the paper, basically. So it had to be kind of with authors that were in the countries that it was about, and it's a very diverse mix of countries, but they kind of the tagline, I guess, was systems perspectives on transport and energy in low and middle income countries. So really exciting stuff. And I think what we're trying to do is basically embed open research as kind of our founding principle.
that's very encouraging to hear that this information is becoming more and more accessible, that policy briefs and shorter, I guess, more readable versions are also being made available. So that's really, really awesome. We have another question about the gaps in e-mobility. Let's say from a global perspective, we've been able to talk about Africa and the issues and I guess the intricacies that make it an African context. When you think about things on a global scale, what are the gaps in e-mobility research?
Where do I start, really? I think the gaps are between how those interacting sectors truly interact. I mean, I see I find it best to think about research in sort of 10 to 20 year timescales, because that's kind of a typical cycle between knowledge and innovation and change, right? And I think the like train that's coming to us with e-mobility is that if we replace the transport systems as how they are in various countries of the world and just electrify them and don't do anything about them, then we've missed a massive opportunity. And this goes both ways. This talking about places like North America, where you have car dependency, which is kind of locked in, and people without access to mobility are really, it's hard to make an easy time of it. And places, many countries across the African continent where walking makes up such a massive proportion of the modal split, but not through choice, right? It's because people can't afford to take the paratransit options or whatever. So there's kind of a world where you need to lock in e-mobility, the e-mobility transition with a transport sector transition that's both sustainable to the environment and also promotional of people's lifestyles, right? And making it easier for people to live productive lives. And it gets back to the idea of why we travel in the first place. Yes, that's me.
Yeah, I would agree wholly with James there. I'd say that when looking at the electrification of vehicles in, say, African countries, we can't just try and convert everything to electric and expect the systems to now be perfect and sustainable. We kind of need those integrated transport systems that take into account mass rapid transport, and enable people to get from A to B without necessarily needing to own their own vehicle or something like that. That's not necessarily the main goal here. It's mainly to have a sustainable transport system that everyone has access to, and that's equitable access as well. And then obviously these systems, I think what's quite interesting is that, you've got this technological change and there's going to be social changes around that. So I think there's maybe a lot of research gaps, particularly in African countries, where you can look at how this change in technological innovation kind of affects the social aspects and the behavior, and looking at that kind of social aspect of these kind of transitions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you've actually highlighted something that connects to another question that I had. When you look at your backgrounds, they are very technical. You can see that there's a lot of emphasis on how e-mobility ties in with technology. So what does this research look like for people who are, let's say, not from such a specifically technical background, say they're non-technical, they're from, let's say, a humanities-centric background. How do they get involved in now boosting academic research? How do they get involved as well?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think e-mobility is only a technical problem if you only think about a vehicle chassis and a battery and a motor with a constant supply that you can plug in and it works, which is clearly what we're talking about is not the case, right? A big part of what we're trying to do is trying to understand how you can lock in the growth of e-mobility into the growth of renewables, so that you can ensure that these things are kind of ring fencing investments in one another. I mean, it makes a lot more sense to apply for planning permission to build a solar farm if you have a fleet of electric vehicles, whatever those vehicles might be, to charge with the electricity, and that they're going to be sat there in the middle of the day when all that sunlight is flowing down. In order to understand how that can work, you don't need technical people. You might need a few technical people, but you also need finance people. You need economics people. You need social scientists to understand the kind of mobility patterns. You need geographers to look at how that impacts political economies in different at different scales in different localities. And so yeah, massive opportunity. I can't think of many specialisms that aren't relevant here, but of course we need support, right? So the whole kind of research ecosystem, I suppose, needs to grow in order to support those different specialisms.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add there. I guess James covered it pretty well. I guess while there is a large portion of e-mobility maybe being quite technical, and there's a lot of engineers involved in doing that kind of research, it is actually quite multidisciplinary. And as James said, there's a lot of other disciplines that can get involved. And we need that kind of full kind of system or full approach from the many different disciplines to kind of solve these types of issues.
Thank you so much for sharing insights on that. We have a question here from Sharon Maloba, who says, has any research been done on the grid emission factors that will impact the charging of electric vehicles in Kenya?
So I can start off with that maybe. As far as I know, there isn't much data on the grid emission factors in Kenya. I'm not too sure if James knows otherwise, but it seems it's one of the requests for data that I've asked for during this Charge Up project that we're working on is, do the generators like KenGen or Kenya Power have this type of information to supply us with in terms of grid emission factors? There are average grid emissions factors, based on, for this year there's an estimated emissions factor. But in terms of more fine-tuned data in terms of grid emissions factors at different times of day, that type of information doesn't really seem to be available. And that's something that would be, I think, really important to understand, because obviously charging your motorcycle or car or electric bus at different times of day would obviously have different emissions related to it, and you want to obviously optimize that to reduce emissions. Obviously, the grid in Kenya is very green. There's, I think, can't remember the latest numbers, but it's over 85% renewables, which is really great to see. So at least those impacts aren't as high as you would have in another country that has a much larger portion of fossil fuel-based electricity generation. But it is really important to understand.
Yeah, no, Cameron knows better than I do. I just put a picture in the chat for anyone interested in that was very much based on average stuff, and it's not specific to Kenya. This is an early CCG paper looking at the benefits of e-mobility across the African continent, and that graph it's just quite a powerful kind of demonstrator on the potential carbon emissions reduction from a switch to electric vehicles. So Kenya's up there, right? Because of it, as Cameron said, it's high renewables power system. But yeah, more work needed, right, to understand the variation between times of the day.
Thank you so much for sharing that response, and thank you for sharing the link. Thank you, Sharon, for that really important question. So the audience is encouraged to share more questions in the chat. We are having a very engaging and interactive session. So if you do have any questions you'd like to address, please add them to the chat. And also there is a question here about how can academic research, like the case of Charge Up, be used to inform policy development for not just sustainable vehicles, but infrastructure and planning as well?
Yeah, so, well, a big part of the Charge Up project is to look into the battery swapping infrastructure for electric motorcycles. So the the commercial partners that we're working with both use the battery swapping regime for their motorcycles, not necessarily plug-in charging. And we're looking into that infrastructure and planning side of it in terms of optimizing those locations, and also looking at the ideal configurations in terms of how many battery swap stations do you need in a city like Nairobi, depending on the adoption levels of these motorcycles. So a lot of the research that we're doing should have a direct results related to that kind of infrastructure planning as well. And those results will be also open and released once the project is over.
Yeah, nothing to add really. I think that was directed at Cameron because of the charger reference. But I mean, just seeing some news for the Nairobi charging master plan, I think is a good example of that, which came out of ChargeUp, or is that related?
Yeah, that will be one of the kind of outputs of the project. Yeah.
Oh, great. And then the question here from Kwikiriza Ivan, he is asking about what are the approved or defined metrics for calculating carbon credits in e-mobility?
So as a my kind of from kind of outside this exact world, there's no standard for carbon credits in different modes of e-mobility other than electric four-wheelers, although please correct me if I've missed the end of the stick there. And one of the research gaps is defining something that we can use. Carbon markets is an interesting, and it's a tricky problem, right? Because there's voluntary carbon markets, there's voluntary credits. There are ways where companies can sort of, for better word, fudge the kind of methods that they're using to calculate credits, and I think a kind of robust way of making this work for the transition in Africa is vital, because it kind of provides a pathway for a lot of the kind of really exciting companies in this area. But actually, Cameron, you've worked with more of these in mobility, and in fact, Bijou, if you have any expertise with your consultancy hat on, then you should be we should redirect the question.
Yeah, from my side, I agree with you. At the moment there is no particular approved method for doing this for electric motorcycles or three-wheelers or anything like that. As far as I know, there is a standard produced by Vera, and that's for charging infrastructure for normal cars, four-wheelers, and that's normally in countries like the US, where there is enough data available to kind of verify the additionality of the carbon credits, I guess, or the emissions mitigated through charging. So that is a big research gap, and that some sort of framework does need to be developed for the African context specifically, especially because a lot of the sources that they use for Vera, for example, I think uses the IEA's data on the number of electric vehicles in different countries, and that kind of data isn't really available for, I think, really most African countries. So even when just trying to apply that method directly to an African country, the verification part of it kind of falls away, because that type of data isn't available from, let's say, a credible source. So those kinds of systems need to be kind of put in place.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing, Cameron. And let's see. Another question here in the chat is, what opportunities exist in pairing research opportunities with startups who are constantly refining their business models?
Opportunities. Well, I guess there's a whole bunch of opportunities for startups to get directly involved in research projects. So there's funding calls, there's competitions. In a UK context, we have something called the Energy Catalyst, which the funding call was open for this summer, which was open to companies participating anywhere in the world. And a lot of these proposals go forward with startups directly taking a lead in this space. So I think that there's loads of opportunities for kind of active collaboration, for kind of I think maybe Cameron, you could speak about your involvement with the Charger project and other stuff at Strathmore University with their involvement in with local companies.
Yeah, so we're partnering with Fika Mobility and Arkride, as I mentioned earlier, and through this collaboration, we're able to collect data from their vehicles and then analyze that and inform them in terms of how they can deploy their infrastructure and kind of adapt to the ways that their clients or the users of their services are using their services. So there's the opportunity when you're collaborating together to kind of, while doing research, share those learnings, and that really can help them, I guess, as they're developing those business models and growing. So I think that's, yeah, collaborating with startups is a very useful way to kind of get this type of data as well during the early phases of commercialization of these different products, because the data doesn't really exist elsewhere or in other means. So it's a really helpful relationship to have with these startups.
Thank you so much for sharing your views. These are really, really good responses. And I think I'm learning so much, and I believe the audience is as well. I'm looking at the time, and I think this is a good time to sort of kind of come to a bit of a wrap up of the session. It's been really great just to learn about all these things. If you could be able to provide maybe, I guess, a last word or a parting shot as to Africa's state in academic research in terms of boosting it. Are we on track? What would be your recommendations and your, I guess, your ideas on ways of really enriching our academia and just the environment in general for e-mobility?
I'll go ahead. So I guess it's a very exciting field to be in. There's a lot happening. There's a lot of movement on the ground with these different startups commercializing their vehicles and slowly releasing those. So we're seeing a lot of movements and dynamics happening there. And I would say, in terms of trying to really boost e-mobility research and collaboration, I would say that, you know, all stakeholders kind of need to evaluate how they can best contribute to the e-mobility research community and the commercial side as well. And that kind of starts by having more conversations with other stakeholders to determine their various needs. So I would encourage, you know, more open discussion like we're having today, so that stakeholders can kind of get on the same page and support each other in boosting e-mobility research and ultimately achieving those positive impacts within the different local regions. And maybe a practical step would be for, you know, more researchers to get involved in e-mobility research networks across Africa. Whether there are many that exist at this moment in time, I'm not too sure. So if anyone is aware of particular e-mobility research networks in Africa, that would be really interesting to hear about as well. So please share in the chat if you know of any.
Yeah, the only thing I think I would add, just kind of reiterate that, and I think the main thing perhaps is making use of international connections as well, right? So, like, I mean, we're talking to we're talking on the African e-mobility week, but we've mostly been talking about Kenya with a few exceptions. So there's a kind of massive opportunity to share learning, right? Perhaps Kenya and other countries in the kind of pocket of East Africa are more advanced in the e-mobility transition than others. So it would be really great to kind of see those networks being placed out across borders and also outside of Africa. So I mean, the use case of two-wheelers in some African cities is pretty similar to how it is in some South Asian cities. and they've had learnings in some Indian cities, for example, that might be relevant to some East African cities, and you know, there are these kind of similarities across the globe, right, that I think are just waiting to be made use of. And there's a lot of funding available in these global streams. So yeah, make friends using the internet. I think that's my message for myself and everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I mean, these are really helpful ideas, and I think this session has been incredibly eye-opening in just revealing the current state of academic research in Africa, and even on a global perspective. I think the audience has been incredibly interactive, sharing resources. I can see Alphonse has shared an article here, and so many other questions that have really contributed to the enriching experience that we've had this time during this webinar. And I do want to remind our audience that for those who are in Nairobi or may be coming to Nairobi, on Saturday, the 29th of October, there is going to be an exhibition, a physical in-person exhibition for e-mobility in Africa. So there'll be booths there. It's free to the public, so you'll be able to engage with the main stakeholders who are pushing the e-mobility message in Africa. And thank you so much to our panelists, to Ignatius, who unfortunately had a technical problem, but was able to contribute in the beginning. We're grateful to him for the time he was able to contribute. Thank you so much, Cameron. Thank you so much, James. I mean, from all over the world, like, we've been able to have a really cool discussion, and I really can't wait for future forums like this, where we can be able to discuss and collaborate in order to, I guess, be able to grow together as a collective. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Bijou.
Thank you, Bijou. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining. And if you have other questions, please feel free to reach out as well. Yeah, so thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.